So tell me, what are you willing to sacrifice to do the right thing?
This is madness. We just can't.
It shouldn't be too controversial to say that video games that try to present players with moral choices often do a poor job of systematizing morality systems. Whether it's the binary choices of BioShock, the binary choices of Infamous, or, the binary choices of Red Dead Redemption 2, video game morality systems tend to present simplistic decisions between obviously right goods and obviously wrong evils. And it's even worse when character abilities are locked behind consistent morality decisions, so you're forced into one pole, or the different moral choices impact the way your protagonist looks. These decisions don't offer much in the way of nuanced role-playing. While players aren't usually locked into a morality track, it's not uncommon for players to treat each track as a separate playthrough, and it's usually because there's such a disconnect between the options. So in Mass Effect, for instance, which is one of my favorite series, Renegade Shepard is basically a whole different protagonist than Paragon Shepard is. In part because there isn't much room for moral ambiguity, at least without the protagonist seeming like a very eclectic person. But I want to talk about a morality system that I think is particularly interesting. Fable 3 has some interesting things to say about morality and government. Yes, I know the game is virtually irrelevant at this point, but I have a lot of good memories of this game, and it struck me the other day how strange some of its themes are. When I played it, I searched to find the first gay NPC I could find, and was determined to marry him, so I literally held his hand and dragged him from the Dweller camp, through a cave with enemies, and through basically the rest of the game until I can marry him and house him in the castle. Ah, Kel. You play as the second child of the hero of Bowerstone, the protagonist of Fable 2. Like many games with binary morality systems, the consequences of your choices are clearly telegraphed. Good decisions are marked with a heavenly white light, and evil choices are marked by red flames. As the game starts, you're introduced to your older brother, the tyrannical King Logan, who is, as is the official term, a soggy chicken nugget. Partway through his rule, he institutes child labor, shuts down education, dumps the waste from his industry without regard for the environment or the people that live there, cuts wages to effectively nothing, and institutes slavery. So, he's a capitalist. As the game begins, Logan has had a factory worker executed for standing up for another worker, and a resulting civilian demonstration comes to the castle to protest the authoritarian regime. In order to stop the demonstrations, he proposes to start shooting the protesters, starting from the leaders and working down until everyone has either run away or been killed. You end up trying to convince your brother to be slightly less of a terrible person, but he's not happy with what he sees as a sign of weakness. So Logan tells you need to toughen up, and he gives you an ultimatum, and the first major choice of the game. Do you execute the organizers of the civilian protest, or execute your childhood crush? And side note, the fandom wiki somehow frames this as a sign of Logan's love for you, because he's trying to force you to understand that you'll have to make tough decisions as a royal, and that's a unique take on the situation. Unlike any of the other choices in the game, this does not affect your morality, though. However, it does establish the major themes of the story. The choice sets off the plot where you and some servants run away from the castle and try to plot a coup. You travel the kingdom, learning about the misdeeds of Logan, and making promises with civilian leaders to fix the problems Logan has created by his greed and authoritarianism once you become the new ruler. About 2/3 through the game, you do actually manage to overthrow your brother and become the new ruler. The only problem is, you learn there's a horrifying external threat called the Crawler, which has destroyed the autonomous city-state of Aurora, and is coming to destroy Albion. This reframes Logan's oppressive regime. Theoretically, his policies were inhumane only because he was looking out for the long-term survival of the kingdom and its civilians. He needed to shut down the schools and cut wages to prepare for a scary, undefinable external threat that threatens the existence of the entire kingdom. Wonder what this reminds me of. So as the new monarch, you're now tasked with creating policy and responding to the needs of the kingdom, while also balancing raising money to build an army for the impending Crawler threat in a year. Mechanically, how the system pans out is a series of binary policy decisions that you're asked to make that have predictable moral and economic outcomes. If it gives you moral points, it subtracts from your treasury, which is needed to save lives when the Crawler comes, and if it loses you moral points, then it adds money to the treasury. The only exception is the choice to decorate your kingdom with either good or spooky decorations. This affects nothing, except for #aesthetics. The morality system uses a false dichotomy to frame moral choices. Either prioritize short-term benefit by being a benevolent ruler whose kingdom will ultimately be unprepared for a larger existential threat, or prioritize long-term benefit by being an oppressive tyrant in exchange for saving lives from the threat. But some of these choices are a little strange, so let's walk through them. So we got setting the tax rate. Lower taxes is good and raising taxes is evil. Put a pin in this. And notice how the treasury impacts aren't analogous. That's a consistent thing. Raising taxes gives you 200,000 gold, lowering taxes loses you 400,000 gold. Supporting education is good, reinstating child labor is bad. That tracks. But supporting education costs you 200,000 gold and the opportunity cost of free child labor. You can rebuild the old quarter and make it habitable again, or choose not to reinvest in it and leave it as a historic site, which is somehow just as evil as reinstating child labor and raising taxes. What else? Funding the medieval police is good, lowering the budget is bad. Because especially after overthrowing an authoritarian regime that used state violence to execute protesters, I'm sure the kingdom is so excited to have more guards running around doing the bidding of the crown. Kaelin comes back to ask you to keep your promise to rebuild Aurora, and you can invest 700,000 gold into it, or renege on your promise, and instead institute indentured servitude for the entire city-state to pay for their colonization. And you only gain a bit more than double what you gain from lowering the guard budget. And also, even if you do the good option, Aurora becomes incorporated into the Albion Kingdom anyway, and I know in this case it's presented as a positive thing, but that seems very, very optimistic. You can donate the funds of a treasure to the war effort or keep it for yourself. You can restore child benefits or fine civilians for having children, which, by the way, wouldn't having more children be good for the treasury if you've reinstated child labor? You have the choice to renovate the homeless shelter and orphanage or turn it into a brothel, which gives you 1,250,000 gold, which is more than you get from subjecting an entire city-state to indentured servitude. The brothel is extremely lucrative, and I guess the profits from the brothel go directly to the crown, which has some really uncomfortable implications for the autonomy and workplace safety of the sex workers. Logan also has a drinking limit in the kingdom for some reason, and you can remove the drink limit as a good option and lose 100,000 gold or outlaw alcohol to gain money. And I might just be dense, but I really don't understand this one. How does removing the drink limit cost the treasury money? If anything, couldn't you tax the alcohol to raise additional funds for the crawler defense? So, there's a lot more, but let's just work with these. Each of the binary decisions have identical moral outcomes. The good option gives you 25 morality, the bad option loses you 25 morality. This means that mechanically, each of these moral choices are evenly weighted. Funding the police is as good as investing in the homeless shelter. Reinvesting in the old quarter is the same as doing a slightly more benevolent colonialism. And on the flip side, raising taxes is the same as reinstating child labor. Raising taxes is the same as converting an orphanage into a brothel. Raising taxes is the same as colonialism. The binary system makes all of these choices a series of zero-sum games of equal weight. You can't raise taxes on just the nobility to help pay for social services like education and child support. The services have to come directly from the same pool of money set out for defense against the crawler. All resources must be directed towards this existential threat in order to keep everyone alive. Which, speaking of the crawler, you don't have the option to tell the kingdom about this external threat. Logan never told the populace he was trying to save lives, so the policies he enacted to cut corners just looked like purposeless authoritarianism instead of, purposeful authoritarianism. Granted, the average person likely wouldn't believe if their leaders said there was an encroaching supernatural external threat that the kingdom needed to defend itself by redirecting disproportionate resources to defense spending. Right? But in this case, they have proof and multiple eyewitnesses, and also, Aurora was destroyed by the crawler. Surely it would be easier to raise the funds and justify to the populace cutting some corners in order to prepare for the threat if civilians knew what was happening. This is additionally baffling because you're using the funds you're raising to raise an army. They're going to find out what's happening in less than a year anyway when you start drafting and training soldiers to fight a crawler. But the way the system is set up, the ignorance of the civilians is taken for granted, and it's up to the rich monarch to make decisions for the greater good of the populace, even if it means temporarily doing a little human rights violation. Now, there is a way to get around the false dichotomy of be a tyrant that saves lives and be a benevolent ruler that gets everyone killed. You can do what I did and what all my friends did. If you own any property in the kingdom, you collect rent every 5 real-world minutes. So if you raise rent as high as it can be, or just leave the game on for a ridiculous amount of time, you can pass all the good policies while still having enough money to protect the kingdom. So I guess the moral of the story is the landlords will save the world? Raising the rents actually does lower your morality, but you can counteract that by just lowering the rent again once you have the money you need. Strangely, you can't do that with taxes. That's a one-and-done thing. But while that is the workaround you can do without technically cheating, it's clear from the framing of the plot and the game's mechanics that this is not the way you're technically supposed to play. The game is built around presumably difficult decisions. It opens with a difficult choice that's supposed to hammer in the idea of sacrificing for the right thing. Logan explicitly says as much. Sacrificing for the greater good when you're the monarch is letting your reputation tank in order to save lives. But of course the major damage of these policies isn't the reputation of the monarch. Yeah, people will hate you, but that's not the main evil. It's the authoritarian policies that force civilians into slavery and leave the homeless and orphans with no support and nowhere to live. It's not your sacrifice, but it's framed that way. Thematically, Fable 3 seems to have a rather unfortunate message that sometimes authoritarian regimes are really just looking out for you. Sure, maybe it'll annex a different autonomous city-state and consign it to indentured servitude, but really it's trying to protect you from a scary external threat that it won't tell you about. And that seems like a really terrible message that's in part a result of a mechanically rigid way of depicting morality. This type of morality system is inherently a zero-sum game. We can't depict the morality of true sacrifice for the benefit of others without constructing impossible scenarios where the good option narratively is to execute a close friend, and the bad option is to execute protesting civilians. Or the good option is to fund education, where the bad option is to reinstate child labor. These are obvious fairy tale moral quandaries, akin to some of those really unsubtle workplace culture training videos where 3 of the answers are variations of scream at or beat up your coworkers, and the last one is respectfully communicate your ideas at work. The natural outcome of having comedically incompatible moral tracks that are linked on a single spectrum is to undermine the seriousness of the moral question in the first place. Other game systems have tried to approach these kinds of questions in other ways, with varying degrees of success. Even though narrative-driven games like Telltale games often have pretty limited consequences to the ways you treat characters, I do think it is legitimately cool to have the morality scale, so to speak, not linked to a universal calculated number, but specific to your relationships with different characters. This allows for a lot more nuance. Is your lead generally supportive of a collective group-based good, except he really hates Kenny? Does he just kind of play the field and only look out for himself and Clem? There's a lot more room to roleplay the character in interesting human ways that don't feel locked in tracks that you're following just to get a special ability, or a cosmetic accessory, or a specific ending. The game doesn't mechanically determine whether Lee is a good person or a bad person because they give him a halo or red eyes. You're allowed the ability to interpret his actions himself, and what that says about a reflection of his character. Undertale is by far the most successful attempt at a morality system that I've played, and again it's a result of having a wide spectrum of potential outcomes. It's not an on-off switch between the game's true ending and its worst ending, it's the culmination of a lot of individual choices. And these are choices that aren't telegraphed with a white halo or fire and brimstone. They're choices based on how you're living your life in the virtual space and playing through the mundane sections of the game. This perhaps best represents moral decisions people face in the real world, where your reputation is not necessarily built on major telegraphed decisions, but everyday interactions and the small ways you treat people that have much to say about your underlying ideas about the value of other people. Fable 3's morality system mechanically limits the type of story that the game could tell, and turns what was probably already going to be a questionable message about how sometimes good must come from ruthlessness into a really questionable message about how sometimes the suspension of human rights and the egregious violation of civilian autonomy and dignity is worth it because you have to make tough, hard decisions as a ruler for the good of everyone in the kingdom. And that's going to be a yikes for me.